screams echoed off the stone walls of Tordesillas castle, reverberating through the empty corridors, until they faded into the vastness of the Castilian night. A 46-year-old woman dressed in rags that had once been royal robes desperately pounded mortar on a fresco, slowly covering the only window in her chambers. The sun was disappearing forever from her world, as was fresh air and any hope of freedom. Brick by brick the light was extinguished, as the masons worked under strict orders. Queen Hannah was to be walled up alive in her own castle. Outside, her son, the powerful Emperor Charles V, awaited the report of the completion of the work. The woman with a legitimate claim to the most powerful throne in Europe was literally being erased from the world, condemned to exist in the shadows for the rest of her days. This was Joanna of Castile, daughter of the legendary Catholic monarchs Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, heir to a vast empire and victim of the cruelest political conspiracy of the 10th century. The queen whom history would unfairly call Joanna the Mad was about to disappear behind stone walls for almost 40 years, a medieval punishment carried out in the midst of the Renaissance. But what could drive a son to imprison his own mother in such a barbaric manner? And was Joanna truly mad, or simply an inconvenient woman for power-hungry men? To understand the horror of Joanna's fate, we must go back to the beginning, to a time when the world was radically changing and being born a woman, even as a royal princess, was a constant danger. Born on November 6, 1479 in Toledo, Joanna was the third daughter of the Catholic monarchs. At first glance her future seemed bright. Her parents had unified Spain after centuries of fragmentation, expelled the Moors from Granada, financed Columbus's voyage which would pave the way for a global empire, and establish Spain as the emerging power in Europe. Joanna grew up in the most splendid court of Christendom, receiving an exceptional education especially for a woman of that era. Fluent in Latin and French by the age of 12, Joanna revealed a keen intelligence and a vivid temperament that worried her stern Catholic mother. The young princess also displayed a disturbing tendency to. Religious dogma was a dangerous trait in a country that had just established the brutal Spanish Inquisition. Isabella observed with growing alarm that her daughter preferred philosophy to blind devotion. "She speaks too freely about matters that should remain unquestioned," wrote a court cleric in a secret report to the queen. Like all princesses of the time, Joanna was barely a piece on the chessboard of European marriage politics. At 16, she was betrothed to Philip the Fair, son of Emperor Maximilian I of Austria, and heir to the vast territories of Burgundy and Flanders. The proxy marriage took place in 1496, but the first time the bride and groom met was months later, when Joanna traveled to Flanders to finalize the union. The initial meeting between Joanna and Philip instantly became legendary, described by chroniclers as the most handsome man of his time, with golden hair and blue eyes. Philip was the embodiment of the chivalric ideal. Joanna, with her deep Spanish brown eyes and olive skin, was immediately spellbound. According to witnesses, the bride and groom were so mutually attracted to each other that they insisted on consummating the marriage immediately, rejecting the planned elaborate ceremony. "They did not even wait for the banquet to be over," wrote one scandalized ambassador, retreating to his chambers still dressed and ordering that no one be disturbed for 2 days. This passionate beginning, however, concealed the seeds of a future tragedy. Philip, although physically attractive, possessed a manipulative and cruel character. He quickly realized that his wife was completely in love with him and decided to use this as a weapon of control. In the early years of their marriage, Philip alternated between public displays of affection and humiliating betrayals with lovers at the Flemish court. Joanna's response to this treatment began to shape her reputation. Unable to hide her emotions as royal etiquette dictated, the princess had public outbursts of jealousy and anger. Such behaviors were common among male monarchs of the time. Joanna's own father was infamous for his extramarital affairs. But in a woman, especially a Spanish Catholic princess, they were considered evidence of mental instability. In 1498, Joanna gave birth to their first child, a daughter named Eleanor. Over the next 7 years, she would become pregnant repeatedly, giving Philip 6 sons, including the future Emperor Charles V born in 1500, and Ferdinand I, who would succeed his brother as emperor. Joanna went through cycles of apparent depression, possibly exacerbated by Philip's coldness and the cultural isolation she felt at the Flemish court. Joanna's fate took a dramatic turn when a series of unexpected deaths placed her in the direct line of succession to the Spanish throne. First, in 1497, her only brother Prince John died at age 19. In 1498, her older sister Isabella died in childbirth. In 1500, Isabella's son Michael, who had become the heir apparent, also died in infancy. Suddenly, Joanna, the third daughter never raised to rule, became the heir to the United Kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, the nucleus of what would become the largest global empire up to that point. This twist of fate completely transformed the dynamics of Joanna's marriage. Philip, who had previously viewed his wife as little more than a useful connection to wealthy Spain, now perceived that she would be queen in her own right, and he, at most, a king consort, unless of course Joanna was somehow unfit to rule. In 1504, Isabella of Castile died. Her will stipulated that Joanna was to succeed her as Queen of Castile, but that her father Ferdinand was to act as regent, should Joanna be unwilling or unable to rule. This ambiguous clause became the legal basis for what was to follow. Joanna and Philip traveled to Spain in 1506 to take possession of the Castilian throne. During the voyage, a terrible storm nearly sank the ship. While the crew panicked, Joanna maintained a stunning calm, tying her most important documents and a large amount of gold to her waist, declaring, "If we are shipwrecked, at least they will find my body, and know that I am the queen." This rational behavior in an extreme crisis strongly contradicts the image of madness that would later be constructed. Upon arriving in Spain, Philip immediately began maneuvering against Ferdinand of Aragon, now his father-in-law. Civil war seemed imminent, but Ferdinand, sensing his precarious position, without the support of the Castilian nobles, withdrew to his kingdom of Aragon. Philip was recognized as King of Castile jointly with Joanna, but his actions made it clear that he intended to rule alone. Over the following months, Philip systematically isolated Joanna from public life. Carefully planted rumors of her insanity began to circulate. Any emotional behavior, even tears over the death of his mother, was presented as evidence of mental imbalance. In September 1506, just 3 months after assuming the throne of Castile, Philip died suddenly after drinking cold water during a game of pelota, the ancestor of tennis. He was just 28 years old. Although some historians suspect poisoning, he likely died of typhoid fever or pneumonia. Joanna's reaction to her husband's death would become the definitive proof of her supposed madness in the traditional historical narrative. According to accounts, she refused to bury the body, keeping it beside her, occasionally opening the coffin to kiss the corpse's feet. She traveled with the body throughout Castile, allowing only nighttime journeys, and insisting that only celibate priests could approach the coffin, supposedly to protect the deceased from female temptations. These accounts, however, were greatly exaggerated by her political enemies. Contemporary documents show that Joanna did in fact order the body embalmed and transported to Granada, the burial site chosen by Philip. But the journey was interrupted several times by political disputes. The custom of keeping vigil over the body of a loved one was also not unusual at the time. What really mattered, however, was not Joanna's behavior, but what she represented politically. With Philip's death, Joanna was now the undisputed Queen of Castile. For his father Ferdinand and later for his son Charles, this was unacceptable. Ferdinand quickly returned to Castile, declaring himself regent in accordance with Isabella's will. In a meeting with his daughter in Tordesillas, he promised support and respect for her authority as queen. "You will govern and I will advise you as a father should," he declared publicly. Privately, however, he had already decided that Joanna would never exercise the power that rightfully belonged to her. In 1509, Ferdinand forcibly confined his daughter to the convent of Santa Clara in Tordesillas. There she would be kept prisoner for the rest of her life. Although at first she could still receive a few selected visitors and maintain limited contact with the outside world, this initial confinement, however, did not completely eliminate the threat posed by Joanna. Although isolated, she was still legally queen. All decrees were issued in her name, even though she had no real involvement in their content. Ferdinand, as regent, needed to maintain the appearance that he was ruling in the name of his incapacitated daughter. When Ferdinand died in 1516, Joanna's son Charles, barely 16 years old, inherited the kingdoms of Aragon and was appointed regent of Castile. The regency was to be temporary until he came of age, but Charles quickly made it clear that he had no intention of returning power to his mother. In 1517, Charles visited Joanna in Tordesillas for the first time. Accounts of this encounter vary dramatically. The official version states that Charles found his mother in a miserable state, dressed in rags, refusing to wash, and completely irrational. However, letters from members of Charles' entourage describe a calm, articulate woman perfectly. Aware of her situation, the queen spoke with great clarity on the affairs of the kingdom, wrote one advisor in a confidential letter, questioning decisions made in her name, and expressing a desire to be regularly informed about the government. At no point did she show any signs of the much-talked-about madness. What happened during that visit would forever change Joanna's destiny. She probably refused to formally abdicate or recognize her son's authority as more than a temporary regent. For Charles, who already saw himself as an absolute ruler, and was negotiating his election as Holy Roman Emperor, this was unacceptable. After Charles's departure, Joanna's conditions of confinement deteriorated dramatically. Her faithful servants were replaced by brutal guards, led by the Marquis of Denia, a man known for his cruelty. Denia was given specific instructions to completely isolate the queen and report any behavior that could be construed as insanity. In letters to the emperor, Denia admitted to using systematic psychological torture against Joanna, including the denial of religious sacraments, sleep deprivation, and various forms of humiliation. When she protested against her treatment, this was reported as fits of madness. When she remained silent and resigned, it was described as profound melancholy, another form of madness according to the medicine of the time. Under these inhumane conditions, Joanna's mental health inevitably began to deteriorate. After years of isolation, psychological torture, and continuous gaslighting, any person would have shown signs of imbalance. It was this induced decline that Charles used to justify the final measure. In 1525, following an alleged escape attempt, he ordered Joanna's chambers to be permanently sealed. The masons arrived at the beginning of spring. They methodically began walling up all the windows, except for a small opening too high to reach, which allowed in a minimal amount of light. The main door was replaced with a solid wall, with only a small opening through which food could be passed, and excrement removed. The only means of access to the royal chambers became a secret door, whose keys remained exclusively with the Marquis of Denia. Joanna of Castile, the legitimate Queen of Spain, was literally walled up alive in her own castle. She would remain in these conditions for almost 3 decades. While the Queen disappeared from the world, her son Charles built the largest empire since Rome, with territories in Europe, America, and Asia. He could legitimately claim that the sun never set on his domains. All this power, however, was based on the usurpation of his own mother's throne. Joanna's existence behind the walls became a shameful secret of the Spanish monarchy. Officially, she remained the queen, and all official documents bore her name alongside Charles' with the formula Hannah E. Carlos, by the grace of God, Queen and King of Castile, Leon, Aragon. In practice, she was reduced to a living ghost. Joanna's life in isolation is known primarily through sporadic reports from the Marquis of Denia to Charles. These documents reveal increasingly cruel treatment. During her first years of confinement, Joanna still received paper and ink to write with, but these were withdrawn when the Marquis discovered she was trying to send messages to the outside world through sympathetic servants. The reports also mention frequent discipline meted out to the Queen when she became difficult, euphemisms for beatings and other forms of physical abuse. Joanna's diet was gradually reduced to the bare minimum necessary to keep her alive. Her only solace was carefully selected religious books, permitted only because Charles feared the political implications of completely denying the sacraments to a Catholic queen. In 1539, an unexpected figure brought a brief ray of light to Joanna's darkness. Saint Francis Borgia, a former courtier who had become a Jesuit after his wife's death, was sent by Charles to check on his mother's condition. Borgia was horrified by what he found. In his diary, he described Joanna as a living skeleton, dressed in rags, but with eyes that still burned with intelligence and royal dignity. Contrary to his instructions, Borgia spent hours conversing with the queen about theology and philosophy, topics she still discussed with surprising clarity. He also heard her confession and offered communion, religious rituals that had been denied her for years. In his official report to Charles, Borgia diplomatically stated that he found the queen resigned to God's will. But in his private writings, he expressed his dismay at the inhumane treatment and openly questioned Joanna's alleged insanity. Borgia's visit did not change Joanna's conditions of confinement, but it provided something perhaps more valuable, independent testimony that even after decades of torture, the queen maintained her lucidity and dignity. In the years that followed, Joanna's body began to fail while her mind remained tormented. Sporadic medical reports mention seizures and tremors, possibly symptoms of chronic malnutrition or untreated illness. Her hair, once black and lustrous, grayed prematurely and fell out in clumps. Her teeth fell out one by one without treatment. Her body, once described as a model of Renaissance beauty, became bent and frail. In 1555, Charles V, weary of power and suffering from severe gout, abdicated all his titles in favor of his son Philip II and retired to a monastery. In a final gesture of cruelty, he never informed his mother of this decision. Joanna continued to live as a prisoner, now technically under the authority of her grandson Philip II. Raised to believe in his grandmother's madness, Philip maintained her confinement, but ordered some small improvements in her conditions. The beatings stopped, and she received clean clothes and better food. Belated concessions, however, came when Joanna was already too weakened to benefit from them. On April 11, 1555, after nearly 50 years of confinement, Joanna of Castile died in her sealed chambers at Tordesillas. She was 75 years old and had spent more than half her life as a prisoner. Her body was eventually transferred to the Royal Chapel in Granada, where she rests next to her parents and Philip, the husband whose death served as a pretext for her imprisonment. The official story propagated by Habsburg propaganda perpetuated the image of Joanna the Mad, a beautiful but unstable queen, whose obsessive love for her dead husband rendered her unfit to govern. This convenient narrative masked the more sinister truth. Joanna was the victim of the first documented political psychiatric conspiracy in modern history. Contemporary reevaluations by historians and forensic psychiatrists suggest that Joanna suffered at most from bouts of situational depression, perfectly understandable reactions to the abuse and betrayal she endured. Her alleged insanity was a deliberate political construct, first by her husband, then by her father, and finally by her son, all men who could not tolerate the idea of a woman exercising the power that rightfully belonged to her. The walls that confined Joanna to Tordesillas are long gone, but the metaphorical walls of historical slander persisted for centuries. Only in recent decades have historians begun to dismantle this narrative prison, freeing the memory of the walled-up queen from the slanders that held her captive long beyond her death. The case of Joanna of Castile remains one of the most disturbing examples of how patriarchal power treated inconvenient women, even those of royal blood. A legitimate queen, educated to rule, endowed with exceptional intelligence, and backed by divine right, was literally erased from history by men who could not accept her authority. In the end, perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Joanna's case is not the fact that she was walled up alive, but that her voice was so effectively silenced that for centuries the world believed the lie of her insanity. The true tragedy was not just the physical walls that confined her, but the walls of lies that distorted her memory, transforming a victim into the villain of her own story. The walled-up queen eventually found some form of justice in historical reevaluation, but her life remains a grim reminder that even for a queen, being born a woman in a world ruled by power-hungry men was in itself a potential life sentence. If the story shocked you, do not let her memory fade. Hit like, leave a comment, and subscribe for more untold history.